My name is Brad. Yeah, that's true. Some of you will know me as Laura's husband, which is actually really exciting for me. That, like, that's a way that many of you identify me. Because I'm fond of her, so it's nice to be identified with someone who's so likable. Is that nice? Okay. She didn't want me to say too much. So this is my first time speaking at ECD. Well, I've spoken, I've talked to people, but I've never spoken to them through a microphone. This is my first time up front and speaking. So, that was weird that you guys thought that. Yeah, so, anyway, I have a remote, don't I? This is exciting. There it is. Okay, we're doing a series that Josh introduced last week on the book of Galatians called A Mature Freedom. Galatians, yes. So, Paul wrote this letter to the Galatians. He was one of the first to travel around the Roman Empire to plant churches. And Galatians is a letter that he wrote to a church he planted in Galatia, addressing some of the problems and misunderstandings that they had encountered in trying to follow Jesus. So last week, some definitions that Josh provided for us are, first of all, what is the gospel? Josh defined it as, Paul talks about Jesus gave himself for our sins, God raised him from the dead, and that sets us free from this present evil age. So this present evil age, Josh also took the trouble of defining for us, as any rule or law outside the gospel. Anytime we adopt a system that claims to set us free, the system by which the world operates. So we'll look some more at what that means a little later, and how it's actually quite impossible for us not to be complicit in some way in this present evil age without the freedom given through the gospel. So I'm excited about that fact, and that I get to talk to you about it. So I will be taking the next section of text on Galatians. Okay, that was my first click in ECV. Gotta celebrate the little victories, right? Okay, yeah, nice. So Galatians 1:10 through 2:24, and there's a lot that's packed into this section, so I won't be getting to everything today. But if you want a more in-depth look at what's going on in these passages, a chance to ask questions, to discuss them with other people who are trying to do the same thing, then come to the Bible study that Laura mentioned every Wednesday evening at 47 Dyer Street, which is Matt and Hannah's house, at 8 p.m., and it's a good space to explore the text in more detail than I can get to here with all of my words. Okay, the first thing I want to say, and it's a little, I don't know how I feel about sharing this, but years ago, maybe like 10 years ago, I got it into my head that I should write a book. And I didn't finish, and the reason I didn't finish is my computer was stolen, which was like a gift from God because it was terrible. I still have it, like everything was backed up, but like not having a computer meant I couldn't actually write it. And then I got some space from it and realized like, what am I doing? I think its problem is mainly to do with genre. So it's a little autobiographical. It's a little bit like pseudo-theological. It's a little bit just straight up fiction. I didn't really know what I was doing. And when you read it, you're like, where is this going the whole time? And that's just, I don't know, that's just, that was where I was at the time, maybe is what we can say. So I was living in England and doing a lot of youth work and just kind of figuring things out about my identity and about life in general. And just to give you like a taste of what it was like, I started it off this way. Here goes. I live in England, but I'm not English. I'm from America, from the state of Ohio, born and raised, as some folks like to say. When people tell me they don't know much about Ohio, I smile and tell them there's not a whole lot there to know about now that I've left. And I actually did say that, to be fair, like when people, anyway. But that's not entirely true. Ohio has lots of points of interest, really. I'm just not one of them anymore. Okay, so like, yeah, I had this like self-aggrandizing yet like ridiculously silly tone to the whole thing, and it's just dreadful to read. But there's this one part where I get the idea to okay, I get the idea to fantasize about meeting George W. Bush. Because, he was the president at the time, 10 years ago or so. And I wasn't thinking about this for political reasons, or at least not like directly or partisan political reasons. It's just that I don't think that I thought this through at the time. I was just, typing away, thinking I was going to write a book. But I think what it was is he was someone whose speech, whose decision-making, whose persona defined so much of how I was perceived as an American living abroad. And he was someone who had so much power over people's lives and power over people's deaths as well. And I thought it was somehow strange that so few of us actually got to meet him. Like, what is this man actually like? What motivates him? I had a Swedish friend at the time who would say that she wished she could vote in the American elections because so much of her world was affected by the outcome of the elections. So I think I was trying to figure out what it would. Okay, so I didn't really try to figure out what it would be like to meet him, but I became obsessed with this idea as someone who has so much influence over me and the importance of wanting to understand what's going on there in this person. So I would fantasize in this book about meeting George W. Bush, and it was a little ridiculous, and I'm going to read some of it for you, just for your pleasure. Okay, so here we go. I can see myself ascending the steps of the White House, wearing my plain old jeans and a t-shirt, just to show the man that I'm not jumping through any of his hoops. Hey man, I'd say to the Secret Service guy at the door, I've got an appointment with a Mr. Bush. Everyone would be so impressed by my cool indifference. I'd be escorted through all the necessary security procedures, all the while nonchalantly humming the theme song to the A-Team. When I arrived at the Oval Office, I'd offer him an aged hand-rolled Cuban, which he would shyly refuse as I fired one up for myself. I don't even smoke, but I think I could take it up for an occasion like this. I would ask him all sorts of questions about his family and his friends and life back in Texas. I would tell him some of my favorite jokes, and he would laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh. We would share stories about where we grew up and the places we've been. We would be struck by what different lives we've led, but through it all, I'm sure we would find common ground and plenty of ways to relate to each other, understanding that we all face the human struggle to find meaning and value in this life. I'm sure he struggles to find meaning and value in this life, even if he is the President of the United States of America. But our time together would come to an end, and saying goodbye as we shook hands, him wiping the tears from his eyes, we would talk about how we would have to meet up again sometime soon. I would give him my number and tell him if he's ever in England to give me a call. I know this great curry place, I would tell him. As I left the building, I would shake the Secret Service guy's hand and tell him to keep up the good work. Yes, sir, Mr. Gable, he would say proudly, looking a little nervous and excited behind his sunglasses. Here we go. So that is why I haven't written a book. That's like a good sample. All right, so it's not exactly focused as a work. The point I eventually try to make is that my knowledge of George W. Bush is secondhand. It's mediated by the media. Did you ever make that connection? Media, mediate? Okay, it was new to me. Anyway, so I had this interacting with him as a person and trying to get to know him aside from his politics would probably give me an entirely new impression of who he is, what motivates him, and so on. So much of my perception of him was interpreted for me that before I have a chance to think about it, I wanted to be able to, I wanted to believe that meeting him would make me somehow better able to understand his decision-making, better able to understand what it means for me as an American living abroad. So anyway, in the book, I eventually apply the same notion to Jesus, right? Religion and religious culture itself can be so influential in our daily lives, but yet Jesus, is a person, right? I mean, this is what the Bible talks about. He's alive, and he's more accessible to us than a president. And so I think it's crucial that we, as people who seek to follow him, interact with him personally. Jesus is not a set of beliefs or traditions, I repeat over and over in my fake book. He is a person. And so often in our lives we can be tempted into the ease and comfort and even sense of validation of settling for a relationship to Jesus that is mediated by tradition, by culture, even the frameworks of interpretation that we apply. But he's a person. So we're looking at a passage of Paul's letter to the Galatians today in which Paul argues that this sort of mediation of Christ is not merely a second-rate relationship to him or an unfortunate compromise that we sometimes make as believers, but that it's something that actually is actively harmful to others if we allow ourselves to remain following traditions without actually engaging with the person of Jesus to transform our lives. The gospel is so much more than can be written into our doctrines or our cultural practices. But before I get to that, I'd like to pray. Jesus, thank you that you are the one about whom we are speaking, and you're here right now among us. And I'd like to say that you're welcome here among us. Knowing you is so important, and you love us so much, and that's a love that can transform us. And so I pray that you help us to trust your love as we seek to understand you during this gathering. As we look at this text, you would illuminate your truth, your love, the beauty of the gospel and its ability to transform any sense of pain and of death and of heartache that we have. Be with us today, God. Amen. Okay. Oh, that's up again. Let me just keep clicking, see what happens. That's up again. Let me keep. See, that was like my third and fourth click there, and they were failures, so I'm at like 25%, I think, as far as clicks. But John's here, and he's really helpful. Anyway, so we're going to get to this passage, and I can probably get ready to read it, and that would be helpful. Yeah, thank you. So Galatians 1, verse 10 through, I will read through 12, so just a little bit. Paul says, "Am I now seeking human approval or God's approval? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still pleasing people, I would not be a servant of Christ. For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin. For I did not receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." So the gospel came to Paul through a revelation of Jesus Christ. He's quite clear on that point and quite insistent. He emphasizes it later in the passage. It's revelation, and that's how he knows the gospel. Remember, just to clarify, we were talking earlier that the gospel, well, I was talking, you were just sitting there listening to me. I was talking earlier about the gospel is Jesus gave himself for our sins, God raised him from the dead, and that sets us free from the present evil age. So this is what Paul received through a revelation of Jesus Christ, which I think is wonderful. So it's a revelation of Jesus distinct from a human source, distinct from anything we have been taught, is what Paul claims as his source with the gospel. So that doesn't mean he was unfamiliar with the facts, right? Like he had heard the name of Jesus before this. In fact, he was probably familiar with some of the claims that followers of Jesus were making about him. So what Paul, I think, is talking about is something distinct, than just learning the doctrine. It seems that the gospel is not just about knowing facts. So there's a moment at which these facts become alive to him. They become a reality in the person of Jesus being revealed to him. What once seemed an outrageous claim, that Jesus' resurrection from the dead could set us free, that became life to him, a source of his own freedom from this present evil age. Okay, so I expect many of us have had similar experiences. Maybe some of us haven't, and like that's the purpose of a church, that we're all in different places and we all come together to learn from each other. My own experience, I was raised in a Catholic church that, looking back, I admire largely for the genuine faith of its priest and most of its parishioners, their earnest commitment to follow Jesus and live a life informed by his love. But in that church, I was taught about the forgiveness of sin through Jesus' death and resurrection, about the love of God, the call of Jesus to follow him. I was taught all the facts of the gospel. But for all that, it never occurred to me that accepting the gospel meant anything more than a commitment to believe abstractly in these tenets and to try harder to be a better Christian. That was the summation of my understanding. But then there was a day when I was a teenager. Like many teenagers, I was low on self-esteem and wanting to feel truly loved when all this changed. For me, it happened through music. And I can't say exactly at what point in that day it happened, but I started the day calling myself a Christian because I was raised one. And, you know, I believed it. But by the end of the day, I knew Jesus somehow. I knew that Jesus knew me, and I knew that he loved me. And that love was actually the very thing that I wanted, that made me feel insecure, made me feel like I needed love. I was missing this very love that I found in him. So everything changed. What I found was not a gospel that could have been told, because I was told everything beforehand. But God's love was revealed to me in Jesus. This is an important message, and it's been preached here before. And I'll argue a bit later that we ought to continually wait and expect the gospel to be revealed to us in this way. Even those of us who have, like, we know this stuff, right? Like, even me, who was writing books about it 10 years ago, it's still important. But we should get back to Paul, because he's the star of the show, I guess. Well, Jesus is the star. Okay, never mind. Nobody corrected me. You know what? I pushed the wrong button. That's why. John knows. He looked at me and he knew. Sorry. Anyway, I'm making, yeah, that's me. That's wrong. Anyway. So carrying on from where we left off, you've heard, no doubt, Paul says, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. That's a key phrase we're going to look at, traditions of my ancestors, so keep it in mind. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not conform with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went away at once into Arabia and afterwards returned to Damascus. So Paul gives us his backstory, which I think is crucial to understanding the letter as a whole, which we'll be going through all summer, so pay attention. He was living out the traditions of his ancestors, living for what he had received from a human source, as opposed to the gospel, which he received from not a human source. He was living the tradition in which he was born, and zealously, but the result was violence and persecution. His determined zeal for the inherited religious system of his ancestors gave rise to hatred in him. And to be clear, this wasn't a bad system, right? Like, abstractly speaking, the Jewish traditions were God-given traditions, and they didn't ask him to persecute the church. That wasn't what they were there for. But his zeal to do what was right, his overwhelming desire to do what was good, produced in him something evil. Who knew? Paul became a murderer for the sake of the one who said, "You shall not murder." Something in Paul corrupted the very tradition he was eager to uphold. And that's, I think, what we were talking about, well, Josh was talking about last week, the present evil age of which we're all a part. There are so many systems to improve your life. But what Paul is saying here is that without Jesus, it results in ruin and catastrophe. So Josh called the present evil age any rule or law outside the gospel. Anytime we adopt a system that claims to set us free, Paul's complicity in this present evil age was made manifest in the deaths that he brought about for the sake of the traditions of his ancestors. This is the life that Jesus saved him out of. This is the thing from which the gospel set him free. So he remembers this, and we'll get to this later, how important this is for Paul. He believed himself to be escaping evil through his faithfulness to tradition, but it only drew him tighter in. It took a revelation of Jesus to set him free. But that wasn't the end. Paul wasn't merely freed from his old life. He was freed for the gospel, specifically so that he could proclaim Jesus among the Gentiles, to use Paul's language. That is, to those who weren't Jewish, he wanted to proclaim this gospel. Paul was a Greek-speaking Jew, somebody deeply knowledgeable in the Hebrew scriptures, yet also familiar with non-Jewish culture and customs. He was passionate, dedicated, and he was willing to sacrifice for what he believed in. This is how God created him. That was his nature. And when the gospel came to Paul, it gave the entire arc of his life story a new significance. I like to use the phrase that God works like a revisionist historian. He takes the facts of the past and he reinterprets them in light of the future. But the future is the truth. And he's showing us, Paul talks, what does he say? He says, before I was born, God set me apart. He called me through his grace. So God knows every one of us and has a desire to set us free. And when that happens, for Paul at least, it altered his entire perception of himself. The gospel redefined his past in light of his new calling. He was called to a greater purpose. He was called into a mature freedom. And see what this means for Paul. The energy that he had used to persecute those he disagreed with to their destruction, he could now use to love people with the love of Jesus, so they too could be set free. So it took Paul's nature, what made Paul Paul, and Jesus gave it a way that Paul could be fulfilled in his nature, living out this new calling. He found the life he was created to live by following Jesus, a sacrificial life of love that brought fulfillment to his unique identity. And notice he says as soon as he received the gospel, he went to Arabia. Well, that's where the Gentiles lived, right? Like that's what he was called to do, is preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And so he went to the Gentiles. He began living out his new calling. As soon as he met Jesus, his life was transformed. So this point about God fulfilling our natures is important, and it's a bit subtle as well. So what exactly happened to Paul's sense of identity when he received the gospel? Did he turn in his library card? Did he get a new license? Did he stop being Jewish? Walter Sobchak, anyone? No? Okay, it was a quote from a movie. Anyway, for Paul, it seems the answer to the last question, does he stop being Jewish, is not a simple answer, more complex than yes or no. Did he have to give up his identity for the sake of the gospel? So Paul refers to his earlier life in Judaism, which is on that slide? Yeah, earlier life in Judaism. Yeah, so this is actually the first recorded use of the word Judaism that we have. Which is strange. So that's the first time that we see Judaism as a word referring to a religion, apart from cultural and the culture and tradition of the Jews. It's right there in this letter. So what does that mean? We're quite comfortable with the distinction of culture and religion today. We have no problem separating the two. In our country, a person might be an evangelical Christian, another might be an atheist, another a Muslim, but we're all Americans, right? Culturally speaking, we have the same culture. But it wasn't so clear at the time. The Jews and any other ethnic group that existed had their own customs, traditions, origin stories, their own sense of placement within the larger world, their own culture, and mixed up in all of this is what we might call religion, and specifically the Judaism of the Jews. To be Jewish was a part of all of these things together. But Paul made a distinction that somebody could identify with any culture without practicing the religious practices of that culture was a new concept. And this distinction was something that was rather profound about those who sought to follow Jesus at this time. Following Jesus didn't mean that you had to adopt the culture of a group or follow their specific traditions. Following Jesus is not a matter of culture, I think is a point that Paul is trying to make. So this theme as a whole will be taken up more radically later in Paul's letter when he talks about how the gospel cuts across social boundaries, like class, gender, and race. But it's useful here to understand the way that Paul took the gospel to those who were not Jewish, not as a cultural distinction, but as a fundamental shift in their own identity. Through the gospel, Paul was able to live out a cultural identity that was informed by, but not inseparable from, his religious practice. So that's all to say that some of the trouble that Paul was facing, that he wrote this letter in response to, was this issue, exactly. Like, can you separate religion and culture? And a big thing that was happening was there were people who said, well, Jesus was Jewish, and if you want to follow Jesus, you have to practice the traditions that Jesus practiced. And one of those, the big one, is circumcision, right? It's an outward symbol of, of like what it is, like a cultural adherence to a tradition of the Jews. It was a sensitive issue. I had that written down as a pun, and okay. So, this cultural marching was so important that Paul could refer to entire groups in terms of the circumcised or the uncircumcised. Another boundary was Jewish dietary laws. Do Gentiles have to eat like Jews in order to follow Jesus? In fact, there was a circumcision faction that Paul refers to that developed within the church. That was their thing, like insisting that these customs had to be followed. If you were going to follow Jesus, you had to follow these customs. And Paul wrote this letter to correct that. So there must have been considerable social pressure on these issues, I would imagine. Jesus was, after all, Jewish. If you want to follow him, shouldn't you live by the traditions he lived by? But Paul doesn't seem to the type to bow to social pressure. Remember, he wrote, if I were still pleasing people, I would not be a servant of Christ. And in the same letter, Paul describes the confrontation he had with Peter, another leader of the church. So Peter, I'm going to read another passage. Peter is also sometimes called Cephas, which is, Peter is Greek and Cephas is Aramaic. I'm going to call him Peter because it's all Greek to me. Did anyone see that coming? But yeah, so I'm gonna read. Paul describes a confrontation he had on this very issue with Peter, or Cephas. When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, right? So he used to not follow the cultural traditions of the Jews or require them to do so. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. So there's the social pressure. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? So Peter knew better, right? Like we see that he knew, but he gave into social pressure. And it seems pretty harmless, and it may seem like Paul is overreacting. But we have to remember where Paul is coming from. He knows what it means to follow these very ancestral traditions. He remembers the evil it produced in him, from which he was saved. What Peter was doing was not benign or even conciliatory. You might think that Peter was, being a bit of a politician, trying to compromise to both groups. But what he was actually doing is allowing an insidious discrimination into the church, refusing to eat with someone who is your brother in Christ or your sister in Christ. Paul knows that to insist on these traditions is to be complicit with the present evil age and to participate in evil. And I think that was his main issue with Peter, is because Paul knows where that road leads. He's seen it and it's dangerous, and Peter missed it there. So by his actions, Peter was replacing the salvation offered from this present evil age. The salvation offered by the living Jesus with a mere ritual that leads to corruption. So remember, this is Peter we're talking about. Peter from the Gospels, the one who not only literally walked with Jesus, but walked with him on water. If he can lose sight of the freedom found in the gospel and get mixed up in his own cultural expectations and social pressures, how much more can we? So I think we ought to take Paul's warning to heart and ask ourselves some questions. In what areas of our lives are we allowing our priorities, relationships, traditions, and identity to be shaped by something less than Jesus? These can be cultural. I mean, we've just seen in Charleston an example of how the concentrated residue of the tyranny of slavery and oppression is alive in our world today, and the terrible fruits of someone who adheres to that ancestral tradition. These are real concerns for us today. This present evil age exists, and we need the gospel as much as ever. For me, a struggle that I had when I went abroad, I was talking about George W. Bush, was my identity as an American. Because as I traveled, I met people, I befriended people who were not American. There's a lot of them out there. And some of them are actually nice people. And if you met them, you'd be surprised to find that, sometimes American interests are at their expense. And that's a difficult thing. How do I relate to my country? How do I express patriotism without being complicit in this evil age? I think that, especially in politics, we can see ways in which extreme patriotism, following the traditions of our ancestors, can lead directly, very literally, to death for people. And that's a hard thing. But there are other, how are we using our money, our status? Are we being selfish with it? Are we participating in unjust economies as Americans? These are difficult questions. And what we need to ask is how Jesus can set us free from these. One way that I realized, as I was realizing these struggles, I also realized that, in a sense, that following Jesus was working to redeem at least part of this, my identity as an American, in that I was called abroad to do youth work. I felt like God was leading me to do that, and so I did it. In doing it, though, I realized that I was using my American passport. I was using my access to American wealth to serve other people. And that's actually a really good example of how Jesus can take something that's potentially bad. We have so much power as a country that we can do harm, so much damage in the world. But we can also heal. We can also bring love and truth to people. Maybe a lot of you come from a culture of achievement. This would be another cultural tradition that we might be tempted to follow. A culture that asks you to achieve, to accomplish great things. It tells you that you can change the world, but you end up focusing on yourself, sometimes even at others' expense. You're so concerned to succeed. So for me, this has been a struggle of mine. I just finished my bachelor's degree. I'm a little old for that, but that's okay. I just finished my bachelor's degree, and the plan was to apply to grad school. I think that's what the culture of achievement was telling me, in a sense. You want to go as far as you can go in this world. You want to accomplish as much as you can. So I was faced with this decision to apply to grad school, and when the time came, I couldn't feel peaceful about it. I don't know why, but I had the window open on my computer for like 2 months, or I think every time I say that it's longer, but maybe it was a month. I had the window open like for a month, just waiting, and every time I would see it, every day, I would hesitate because I didn't feel peace about it. And then one day, Laura and I realized that it was too late to apply, which was surprisingly freeing because I was prioritizing listening to Jesus in a way that caused me to let go of my desire for academic success or to hold on to financial security so that Jesus could lead me forward. And that's where we are now. Like, we're waiting for Jesus, and it feels so scary sometimes. But I think we trust him, right? I'm looking at Laura here. She trusts him, so we're good. But anyway, so how is Jesus calling us to seek him in the scope of our lives? Is he asking us to follow him into a place that doesn't look so successful or look so great? Remember Paul was talking about, what's the language he uses? He says, I had advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age. So Paul was like on this track too, right? He knows the achievement culture, but he gave it up because that's what Jesus was calling him to. Now, I think that Jesus also calls people to succeed, but I think that you need to hear that from him. Remember, Jesus is a person. He wants to speak to us. He wants to inform our lives with his love. So anyway, another cultural one, individualism. Sometimes we focus so much on ourselves. Is there anyone around you that you can love and care for more fully? In what ways is Jesus calling us to live intentionally in communities, in relationships, in our jobs, education, family, as neighbors, friends, even strangers? How can these roles and positions be defined by the revelation of Jesus? But things can also be religious. Have we ever let what is comfortable in a religious setting usurp the call of Jesus to love and serve and to worship him from our hearts? I think for me, being in the Vineyard challenges me to participate in a way that's sometimes a little uncomfortable. I have to help figure out how to set up chairs in this room. If we had a cathedral or something, we wouldn't have to worry about that. But that process of having to grassroots shaping the way we worship God together every week, playing in the worship team on that little drum, like that, participating in prayer and community and home groups. These are all ways that sometimes make me a little uncomfortable, actually, but it's good because it forces me to ask questions about what's motivating what we do and to seek God. It's an opportunity not to let the traditions of my ancestors usurp all the traditions of Vineyard, to usurp Jesus' role as informing my priorities, informing my sense of identity, my sense of calling. So, how is Jesus speaking into those areas of our lives in order to free us from the bondage of this present evil age, to fulfill our identities with a calling based on his love and sacrifice? Right, this is the question to ask. Even Peter, got distracted by the wrong thing. So let's use this time, and I suppose the worship team can come forward. We can use this time to seek God, ask if there are areas in our lives that need a refreshing vision of the gospel, that we need to seek him on, to be set free. So how can the gospel inform these areas of our lives? By calling us into a mature freedom, fulfilling our identities and callings based in the love of Jesus. And we need that love of Jesus. I think if I could just go blah and impart something to you today, it would be the desire for the gospel, the desire to know Jesus, to be set free by him, but then the desire to continue seeking him, continue hearing his voice. That's what will shape our world in a way of love and sacrificial service. So we're going to take communion together, which on both sides of me here. And if you are a Christian, or if you'd like to become one, I want to invite you to come forward and tear off a piece of the bread, which is Jesus' body, and dip it into the cup, which is his blood, to remember the sacrifice of his death, and to celebrate in his resurrection that sets us free.